The microphone was still warm from the dean's hand when my son's girlfriend's father stepped up to it, smiled at the crowd, and said, "We are so proud of Nathan today, a fine young doctor. It is a shame, of course, that the people who shaped him could not give him more." He paused just long enough to look directly at me, but I suppose when a mother raises a child alone, in a trailer, on tips and overtime, we must lower our expectations accordingly. 300 people in that auditorium went still. Some laughed quietly, the nervous kind, the kind that escapes before a person can stop it. Some turned to stare at me, and my son, Nathan, froze where he stood in his graduation gown, his diploma still in his hand, his face going white. My fingers went cold. My ears filled with a strange high sound, and something old and sharp moved through my chest like a key turning in a lock I had not opened in 20 years. I did not cry. I did not shout. I stood up slowly, straightened my dress, the nicest one I owned, and looked at that man directly. And I said, in a voice that carried clearly across every row of that auditorium, "Do you know what is interesting, Mr. Hargrove? I do know you, but I don't think you want me to say how." His smile did not fall all at once. It cracked at the edges first, then dissolved like sugar in water, until what was left on his face was not confidence but something much closer to fear. And in that moment, I understood something that made my blood run cold. He had known who I was from the very beginning, and everything he had done in the past 8 months had not been about class or money or protecting his daughter. It had been about keeping me quiet. I need to go back a little, because none of this began in that auditorium. It began the way most things begin, quietly, in an ordinary place. When Nathan was 4 years old, and his father drove away one Tuesday morning and did not come back. I will not spend much time on that part. I have spent enough time on it. What I will say is this. When my son's father left, he took the car, the savings account, and whatever future I had imagined for myself. What he left behind was a little boy with his father's eyes and a woman who had exactly $11 and a box of macaroni. I found work wherever I could. I waitressed. I cleaned houses. I worked the front desk at a motel for 3 years on the overnight shift while Nathan slept in the back office on a cot I brought from home. I told myself every single night that this was not the end of anything. This was just the path. Nathan grew up knowing 2 things deeply. 1, that his mother never stopped moving, and 2, that she never stopped loving him. He did his homework at restaurant tables while I refilled coffee. He fell asleep in my coat on cold bus rides home. He watched me study for my real estate licensing exam at the kitchen table after midnight. And he never once complained. When he told me at 17 that he wanted to be a doctor, I did not tell him the odds. I said, "Then we figure out how." He got scholarships. He worked summers. He applied to every program that would consider him. And 8 years later, there he was, standing in a borrowed suit at a medical school graduation in front of 300 people, holding a diploma with his name on it. He had also, somewhere in those 8 years, fallen in love with Claire. Claire was kind. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her family's money, not the way she dressed, not the address in Connecticut, just that she was kind. She remembered things I mentioned once. She asked about my work. She looked at Nathan the way a person looks at something they are genuinely glad exists. When Nathan brought her home for the first time, she sat at my small kitchen table and ate everything on her plate, and said my cornbread was the best she had ever had. I believed her, but then I met her father. His name was Richard Hargrove. He had a big house, a bigger voice, and the kind of handshake that is meant to remind you of your place. He wore watches that cost more than my car, and spoke about his business ventures the way people speak about things they want you to be impressed by. The first time we were introduced, at a dinner his wife organized, he looked at my hands before he looked at my face. And when he asked what I did for work, and I told him I managed a small property rental company, he nodded slowly in the particular way that means, "That is almost nothing." "Nathan is a remarkable young man," he said later, when the women had moved to the sitting room and the men had stayed at the table. I had come back for my phone and heard him speak through the half-open door, a real self-made story. Of course, boys like that can be unpredictable. Ambition without structure, his wife said. "Richard," he said, "I'm just saying. Claire could have anyone." I stood in the hallway a moment longer than I should have. And I noticed something. When he thought no one was watching, his posture changed. The smoothness dropped away, and something harder sat underneath it, a tightness, a watching quality, like a man who had learned to perform confidence rather than feel it. That night in the car, Nathan said, "He's not as bad as he seems." But his voice had a careful note in it, the kind that means someone is working hard to believe something. The months that followed were full of small moments that each felt like a stone dropped in water, an offhand comment about Nathan's prospects, a vacation invitation to the family lake house that included Claire and her guest, leaving my name out entirely, a birthday dinner for Claire where I was seated at the far end of the table, next to someone's elderly uncle, while Mr. Hargrove gave a speech about the family's legacy. Nathan defended me every time, quietly, carefully, in the way of a person who loves two things that do not fit together and is trying not to break either one. One afternoon, about 4 months before graduation, Mr. Hargrove called me, not Nathan. Me. He suggested coffee. I said yes, because I had learned a long time ago that when someone like him suggests coffee, it is better to go and know what you are dealing with. We met at a place near his office with leather chairs and coffee that cost $9. He did not waste time. He folded his hands on the table and said, "I think we both know this situation is not ideal." I said, "Which situation is that?" He said, "Your son is a good young man, but Claire has a certain future, and I want that future to be uncomplicated." He slid an envelope toward me. I did not reach for it. "That is enough to relocate, to get a fresh start somewhere, for you and your son to build something, separately." My whole chest went hot. I kept my voice flat and even. "You are asking me to convince my son to leave your daughter," he said. "I am making it easier for everyone." I looked at him. I pushed the envelope back. "My son is not for sale, and neither am I." Something moved across his face then. Not anger, not surprise. Something older. Recognition, almost, he said, in a voice that had dropped low enough that the table beside us could not hear. "You are very certain of yourself for someone in your position." "My position," I repeated. He leaned back. "Never mind. Think about it." But what stayed with me was not the insult. It was something smaller, something he said as I was putting on my coat. He said, almost to himself, "You've always had that quality, that certainty." I stopped. I turned. "What did you mean by always?" He smiled, and it was the first smile I had seen from him that was not performed. It was thin and tight, and it had something close to worry in it. "Figure of speech," he said. I thought about that word for weeks. Always. The graduation ceremony was held on a Saturday in May. 300 seats, filled mostly with families who had driven from all over the country. Nathan had one person in those seats, me. I had taken Friday off work. I had pressed my blue dress twice. I had put on the earrings my mother left me. When Nathan walked across that stage, I was on my feet before anyone else, and I did not care who saw. Afterward, in the reception hall, there were speeches. The dean spoke. A faculty member spoke. And then, somehow, Mr. Hargrove had arranged to speak. I do not know how. I only know that he walked to the podium like he owned it. He began reasonably enough. He praised the program. He mentioned Claire's support of Nathan. And then, slowly, as if following a path he had already scouted, he turned the speech into what it really was. He talked about sacrifice and family foundations. He talked about the kind of upbringing that prepares a young person for the world. He looked at Nathan, warm and generous, and then he looked at me, and the warmth went out of his eyes like a light switched off, and he said it. About the trailer, about the tips, about the lowered expectations. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that everyone saw and no one knows how to name. I stood up. I said what I said, and his face cracked. Nathan started moving toward me through the rows of chairs. Claire put her hand on her father's arm and said something sharp and low that made him step back from the microphone. People were turning to their neighbors. Phones were rising. But then something stopped everything. A young man near the back of the room stood up. I did not know him. He was perhaps 30, with a jacket that was slightly too large and an expression that was too controlled to be entirely calm. He said, loudly enough for the front rows to hear, "Mr. Hargrove, you probably don't want to do this." Mr. Hargrove stiffened. His eyes found the young man, and something I can only describe as recognition, followed immediately by rage, moved across his face. Claire whispered, "Who is that?" "Ethan. I mean Nathan." Nathan looked at me. I looked at the young man, and the young man looked directly at me. He said, "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Derek. I think you knew my mother." The room moved into a different kind of silence. I did not know his name, but when he said his mother, and when I looked at his face more carefully, something shifted in my memory. I had known a woman named Sandra 20 years ago, briefly, in the context of a very bad situation, and she had a young son. Mr. Hargrove said loudly, too loudly, "This is not the place." Nathan reached my side. "Mom, what is happening?" I kept my eyes on Derek. I said, "What do you know?" Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded set of papers. He said, "I know that the man standing at that podium changed his name 17 years ago. I know that before he was Richard Hargrove, he was a man named Robert Greer. And I know that Robert Greer was investigated by a federal agency for financial fraud before he disappeared from the state of Ohio." The room erupted. Mr. Hargrove pointed at Derek and said, "That is a lie. That is a delusional, baseless." Derek held up the papers. "Court documents from 2004, filed in Franklin County. I have had them for 3 years. I came here today because I saw your face in a press release about this program." Claire turned to her father. Her voice was quiet and completely different from any tone I had heard her use before. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Mr. Hargrove reached for his phone. He made a call. His voice was low, but I watched his face, and I had spent enough years reading people, waiting tables, managing rooms, watching guests and tenants and strangers, that I could see exactly what was happening. He was not calling a lawyer. He was afraid. Nathan pulled me gently to one side. "Mum, the name. Robert Greer. Do you know that name?" I looked at my son, this boy I had carried through every hard year. This man standing in a graduation gown with his diploma still rolled in his hand. I said yes. When I was 31 years old, I had a second job I rarely talked about. Alongside my waitressing work, I did bookkeeping for small businesses, self-taught, using a second-hand accounting guide and whatever I could learn from the library. I was not a professional, but I was careful and honest, and word got around in the small business community where I lived. A man approached me about managing the books for a property investment group he was starting. He called himself Greer. He was smooth and persuasive, and the pay was twice what I made anywhere else. I took the job because Nathan needed new shoes, and the roof was leaking, and I was so tired I had stopped being careful. For 4 months I managed that paperwork, and something felt wrong from the beginning. Numbers that did not match. Payments that went to accounts I could not trace. Investors whose names appeared and disappeared. I flagged everything. I asked questions. And one day Greer called me into his office and told me that I was no longer needed, and that if I said anything to anyone, he would make sure I was accused of the theft myself, since my name was on every document. I had a 4-year-old son. I had no lawyer. I had nothing. I left. I stayed quiet for years. I told myself I had no choice, and that guilt sat inside me like a splinter I had stopped trying to remove. Sandra was one of the investors. She lost her savings. I had seen her face once, in a parking lot outside the office, carrying grocery bags and looking exhausted, and I had not said anything to her. That silence had lived in me ever since. Her son Derek had been 2 years old. I walked toward Derek through the now standing crowd. People were talking, filming, shifting. Mr. Hargrove was still on his phone. His wife had her hand over her mouth, and Claire was standing very still with that quality of a person who is holding everything together through sheer will. I stopped in front of Derek. I said, "Your mother was Sandra Morse." He said, "Yes." "I am so sorry," I said. I knew something was wrong and I was afraid, and I said nothing. And I have been sorry for 20 years. Derek looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't come here for an apology from you. I came here because he is still doing it." He tapped the papers. "This is not old history. He has been running the same structure. Different name. Different state. There are 6 families in Georgia right now in the same position my mother was." Mr. Hargrove's voice came from behind me, sharp and meant to cut. "You are ruining my daughter's day with conspiracy theories from a troubled young man," Claire said. "Dad, stop talking." It was the quietest thing she had said, and somehow it carried farther than anything else in that room. Nathan stepped forward. He stood next to me, and he faced Mr. Hargrove the way a person faces something they have been circling for a long time, and have finally decided to walk toward. He said, "You offered my mother money to make me leave, Claire." Mr. Hargrove said, "That is," she told me. Nathan said, "Last week. She didn't want to worry me before graduation. She never wants to worry me." He paused. "You did it because you were afraid she recognized you. Not because of money or legacy or any of the things you said. You were afraid she would remember." Mr. Hargrove looked at me. His voice came down to something almost private, the kind of voice that is used when a person is appealing to something they think they can still control. He said, "You have no proof of anything. You have a bitter young man with old paperwork and a grudge. Walk away from this." I looked at him. I thought about the woman I was at 31, the one who left that parking lot without speaking. I thought about Sandra Morse carrying her grocery bags. I thought about $11 and a box of macaroni, and every night I whispered to a sleeping boy that the world would not break us. I said, "My name is Dorothy Caldwell. I worked for you in Columbus, Ohio in 2003, under the name Greer Financial Partners. I flagged accounting irregularities in your books 4 months before you shut down and disappeared. I did not come forward then because I was scared and I had a child. I should have. I will not make that mistake twice." The auditorium had gone almost completely silent. Mr. Hargrove said, very quietly, "You have nothing." Derek opened his folder and held up a document. "She has a witness. Me. And I have been in contact with the Ohio Attorney General's office since March. They have been looking for anyone who worked directly with Robert Greer. Today, they have her." 2 university security officers appeared at the side doors. Someone had called them during the commotion. They moved slowly, professionally, taking in the scene. Mr. Hargrove looked at his phone. He looked at the officers. He looked at Derek. And then he did something I had not expected. He looked at Claire. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Nathan. And Mr. Hargrove's face did something I do not have a clean word for. The structure of it changed. 20 years of performance, of polished surfaces and careful management, collapsed inward, and what was left was just a man who had run out of room. He said, to no one in particular, "I built everything from nothing," Claire said softly. So did she. The officers reached the podium. There were questions. There were phone calls. There were people from the university asking everyone to move to the lobby, and there were reporters who had been covering the graduation for the university newsletter and were now covering something very different. Derek stayed close and answered questions directly. He had prepared for this. He had the documents organized and labeled. He spoke clearly and without drama, the way a person speaks when they have been waiting for something for a very long time and do not want to waste the moment by performing it. Nathan stayed by my side. At one point he took my hand and held it the way he used to hold it crossing the street, when he was small enough that his fingers barely reached around my palm. I said, "I should have told you sooner." He said, "You were protecting me." "I was," I said. "But you're a doctor now. You can handle things." He almost laughed. Almost. Claire came to find us about an hour later, in a quiet hallway near the dean's office, where someone had given us water and chairs. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She sat down next to Nathan and she said, "I need to know everything. Not now, but soon. All of it." Nathan said, "Yes." She looked at me. She said, "I'm sorry for what he said about you. He has been saying versions of that my whole life about people who weren't like us, and I let it happen, and I am sorry." I said, "You don't carry his choices." She said, "I want to be better than the silence." I thought about a parking lot in Columbus. I thought about grocery bags. I said, "Then you already are. What happened after took months, the way real things do. Not the clean 30-minute version, but the slow, procedural, paper-heavy kind." Investigators contacted me formally. I gave a full statement. Derek's documents were verified and handed to the appropriate offices in 3 states. Other people came forward once they knew someone else had. That is usually how it goes. Mr. Hargrove did not disappear again. He had too much to lose this time. A name, a house, a daughter who was watching. The process moved forward the way processes do. Ethan. I keep writing Ethan. I mean Nathan. Nathan and Claire stayed together. They had the hard conversations, all of them, and they came out the other side of those conversations with something stronger than what they went in with. Claire called me once on a Tuesday night and talked for 40 minutes about her childhood, and I listened to all of it. I met Derek for coffee 3 months later. He was quieter without the audience. He had his mother's thoughtful quality, the way she used to tilt her head slightly when she was thinking. We did not pretend the years were shorter than they were. We did not pretend the damage his mother suffered was smaller. But we talked, and talking was something. He said, "She never blamed you, by the way. I want you to know that. She said you were as trapped as she was." I said, "She was more generous than I deserved." He said, "Maybe, but she taught me that holding on to blame just means you're still letting him take something from you." On a Sunday, in October, Nathan and Claire came to my house for dinner. Not a celebration, nothing formal, just dinner. I made the cornbread. Claire brought wine. Nathan changed the light bulb in my kitchen that had been out for 2 months because I kept forgetting to buy the right size. After we ate, we sat on my small back porch in the cooling air, and Nathan said, "I keep thinking about the graduation. About the way you stood up." I said, "I almost didn't." He turned to look at me. "What made you?" I thought about it. I thought about the feeling of sitting back down in that chair, of pressing my lips together, of deciding the price of peace was worth paying. And I thought about how I had paid that price once before in a parking lot in Columbus, and what it had cost, not just me, but a woman I barely knew, and her son, and 6 families in Georgia, and every other person Robert Greer had walked away from because no one spoke. I said, "I thought about every time I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, and I decided I was done paying that particular debt." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to think being brave was something you had or didn't have, like a talent." I said, "It's not a talent. It's a decision you make over and over, usually when you're scared, usually when the cost is real." Claire said, softly, "I think I am just beginning to understand that." We sat there as the sky went dark and the streetlights came on one by one, and I looked at my son, this person I had made from nothing but work and love and refusal, and I felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter and more permanent. Some things cannot be taken back. Robert Greer could not give Sandra Morse her savings back. I could not give her back the years of hardship. No amount of documentation or legal proceedings reaches all the way into the real cost of what a person loses when they are stolen from and abandoned. But some things can still be done. A voice can still be raised in a room full of people. A name that has been hidden can still be spoken out loud. And a woman who stayed quiet once, out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of the specific terror of a mother with nothing standing between her child and catastrophe, can stand up 20 years later in a dress she pressed twice and say, with perfect clarity, what she should have said before. I did not do it perfectly. I do not tell this story because it is perfect. I tell it because the moment I stood up in that auditorium, I stopped being afraid of Richard Hargrove and Robert Greer and every version of the same man who had spent 20 years using other people's silence like a foundation to build his life on. The silence was mine. I had a right to end it. And the thing about ending a silence, once you have done it, is that it turns out to be much lighter than carrying it, lighter than you imagined, lighter than the years of weight made you believe it would be. My son is a doctor. He earned every letter of that degree in libraries and study halls and overnight shifts and borrowed textbooks, and he earned it in diners where he did his homework at the counter while I poured coffee and smiled at strangers. No speech at any podium changes that. No man with a watch and a long table changes that. I raised him alone. I say that not to sound like a hero. I say it because it is why. When that microphone was in front of me and 300 people were watching, I was not afraid. I had already survived harder rooms than that. I had already stood in front of harder silences. And I had promised that boy, every night, in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, that the world would not break us. I keep my promises.